We're going to start this webinar by trying to put in context the issue and really reviewing the importance of food consumption data for decision making. As we know, since 1995 and the decision made by the Codex Alimentarius Commission to adopt the food risk analysis principles as the basis for decision making for food safety and nutrition, all the decisions pertaining to food safety and nutrition, whether being made nationally, regionally, or at the global level, has to be have to be relying on a scientific advice, on a scientific assessment. And that's essentially the component of risk assessment in that set of risk analysis principles. And to be able to conduct a risk assessment, we need to rely on various sources of data. We need to investigate the hazards, to identify them, to be able to characterize their impact on human health. But an element that is so critical to the estimation of risk is to look at the way the hazard is present in the diet, in the foods that we consume, but also the way that diet is, or the way those foods are being consumed. So essentially from one country to the other, from one region to the other, the risk may differ simply because the contaminants or the nutrients may be occurring at different levels, but also because we are consuming food in a different manner. So those two elements, the occurrence but also the food consumption patterns, tend to be geographically limited, meaning that they are influenced by the geography, they are influenced by socioeconomic patterns, and they are influenced very much by the way we consume food. And that's why being able to estimate any type of exposure, let's say from a chemical that may be occurring in various food commodities, we need to look not only at the occurrence of that chemical in that food commodity, but also at how much of that food is being consumed by individuals of a given population. And of course, how much of that food can vary because in a given population, you may have high consumers, you may have low consumers, you may have also variations in consumption that can be based on gender, on age, and on various other parameters. And we need to capture this information if we are to have a good characterization of the exposure. And that's why when we try to gather the information related to consumption, we need to have, to the extent possible, an accurate representation of the way foods are consumed. And we are, of course, aiming to have that refined estimate. But we may still conduct exposure assessments and have access to consumption information that will give us still important information using different ways of collecting the consumption information. And that's what we're going to try to review throughout these discussions. In fact, when we look at some parts or some elements of collecting data in relation with food consumption, we can have a basic estimate using population-based methods. So for example, relying even on food balance sheets, looking at the total food that is available for consumption in a given population and trying on the basis of that information, which is available on a yearly basis, try to estimate how much food is consumed on the basis of these food balance sheets. Now, that's definitely a very rough estimate and does not give us something that is precise. So we need to get more precise information if we want to refine the exposure assessment and therefore a better estimation of the risk. And that's why we try to move to individual-based methods. And individual-based methods tend to be the reference type of approaches, looking at records of consumption, trying even to estimate to the best way possible how much food is consumed and what type of foods are consumed within a 24-hour period, and trying even to see if there are variations of that consumption even in different days of the week. So right now, the gold star approach tends to be what we call the 24-hour recall survey that tends to be administered more than once a week, trying to collect information on what type of food is consumed and how much particularly of food is consumed. We also know that some foods may be consumed on occasions, during holidays, during celebrations. And for that, we need to rely on what we call food frequency questionnaires that will complement the information that may be collected on the 24-hour recall data. Generally, this information will allow us, particularly when we get access to individual data points, it will allow us to plot a distribution of food consumption. And by using this distribution of food consumption, we are able to estimate the exposure in a manner that is more representative to the population for which we are targeting the characterization of risk. But of course, in order to get to this level, we need a high level of investment of resources in order to access this food consumption information. And we're going to be discussing how we can do that and how we can also create collaborations in order to access this type of information. But does this mean that if we cannot do this, we are basically at an impasse? The answer is no. There are some surrogate methods or surrogate approaches that we can rely upon in order to collect data that can represent food consumption. And one of the surrogates is to basically use statistical data that is collected generally by every country. In general, every country through their Minister of Economy or Planning will be looking at economic data, mostly looking at the amount of money that is spent by households. So the household budgets. And using the household budgets and the household expenditures, we can, by focusing on the amount of money that is devoted to food expenditures, we can actually trace back the amount of food that may be consumed. Because what we purchase, of course, by making that approximation, that what we purchase is a representation of what we consume or what we eat, we can have access to that. Of course, this is not perfect in the sense that we do not have individual representation of the data. We do not also have representation that may differentiate gender, age, but is still representative, or at least is more refined than the population-based methods that I mentioned earlier, and would allow us, for example, to conduct probabilistic exposure assessments, particularly if we have individual data points. And given that these data are collected by every country, whatever the level of development of the country, there is a possibility to access this economic data and therefore to be able to convert that information in order to estimate the food consumption data.